The water jacket had boiled dry. Somebody, nobody recorded who, found the Browning M1917 with its barrel still oriented downrange. The cooling sleeve split where the water had cooked off, and the steam vented out through ruptured seams. Behind the gun sat Captain Ben Salomon, slumped against the position he had dragged it to, dead from 76 bullet wounds and bayonet punctures. Ahead of the muzzle, in a rough arc fanning maybe 40 degrees, lay 98 Japanese soldiers. The ratio needs no commentary. That Browning told a story the morning of July 7th, 1944, on the western coast of Saipan, near the village of Tanapag. It told a story about a dentist, a 30-year-old oral surgeon from Milwaukee who held the rank of captain in the 27th Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, who had no business manning a machine gun at all. Salomon ran an aid station. His job involved sulfanilamide powder, morphine syrettes, plasma bottles, not belt-fed weapons. The M1917 weighed 36 pounds without its tripod, fired at a cyclic rate of roughly 450 rounds per minute, and required a two-man crew to operate properly. Salomon operated it alone, long enough to burn through the water jacket entirely. According to the gruesome arithmetic that the recovery team compiled, he killed or stopped nearly 100 men before the volume of fire coming back at him finally ended it. If someone in the family served as a medic, a corpsman, a doc, drop their name in the comments. Like this video, so it reaches the people who carry those stories. Subscribe if the channel has earned it. Read their names out loud. Now, the Browning and the body and the 98 dead tell the end of this story. The beginning starts roughly 4 hours earlier, in total darkness, at about 4:15 a.m. What hit the American perimeter that morning, along a strip of coastal flat near Tanapag, wasn't a patrol or a probing attack. It constituted the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the Japanese garrison on Saipan, knew by early July that the island had fallen. Naval support had evaporated after the Philippine Sea disaster 2 weeks prior. Resupply from the home islands had stopped. Saito issued his final order on July 6th. Every able-bodied man, including walking wounded, cooks, headquarters clerks, would attack south into the American lines at dawn. The objective, if the word even applies, involved breaking through to the Marine positions further south and inflicting maximum casualties before annihilation. According to the after-action report filed by the 27th Division, the attacking force numbered between 3,000 and 4,000 men, though some post-war Japanese sources pushed it higher. They came in waves. Some carried rifles, others sharpened sticks. A few carried nothing but grenades they intended to use at arm's length. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry occupied positions along the coastal corridor, directly in the path of this assault. Salomon's aid station sat roughly 50 yards behind the forward perimeter of the 2nd Battalion, close enough to receive casualties quickly, far enough back to operate under reasonable protection. That distance collapsed in minutes. The first wave of Japanese troops hit the forward foxholes around 4:15 a.m. and simply kept moving. The perimeter didn't hold. It couldn't hold, not against that density of attackers on a front barely a few hundred yards wide. Wounded Americans began arriving at Salomon's aid station almost immediately. Then, unwounded Japanese soldiers began arriving too, bursting through the tent flaps with bayonets fixed. What happened inside that aid station over the next several hours defied every assumption Tokyo held about American medical personnel, that they lacked fighting spirit, that rear echelon troops would break under close assault, that a surgeon caught behind collapsing lines represented a soft target. Salomon's response to the first Japanese soldier who bayoneted one of his patients on a litter ran so far outside those expectations that the full sequence still reads like something from a different war. To understand how a dentist ended up behind a machine gun with a split water jacket and 98 dead men in front of him, the timeline needs to unspool minute by minute. Saito's order reached unit commanders by runner and field telephone throughout the afternoon of July 6th. By nightfall, the assembly areas north of Tanapag, filled with men who had no realistic expectation of surviving the next 12 hours. Japanese doctrine called this a gyokusai, a shattering of the jewel, total destruction preferred over surrender. The term carried spiritual weight in Imperial Army culture. It carried no tactical weight whatsoever, massing 4,000 men into a column attack against prepared American positions with automatic weapons, artillery registered on fixed coordinates, and naval gunfire available on call, represented a decision to convert an army into casualties as efficiently as possible. Saito knew this. He wrote his final poem, knelt, and cut his own throat sometime before the charge began. His chief of staff, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same Nagumo who had commanded the carriers at Pearl Harbor and Midway, shot himself in the head. The two senior officers on Saipan chose death before the attack even launched. That fact alone reveals how they assessed its chances. The column began moving south along the coastal road and adjacent cane fields around 4 a.m. on July 7th. No preparatory bombardment, no coordinated fire plan. A few tanks, 3, possibly 4 Type 97 mediums, rolled with the lead elements, but they carried limited ammunition and no infantry tank coordination doctrine worth the name. The bulk of the force advanced on foot, bunched tight in the darkness, funneled by terrain into a corridor less than 500 yards wide between the ocean and the rising ground inland. Some units maintained formation. Others had already dissolved into mobs of men from different commands, mixed with civilian laborers and Okinawan conscripts carrying sharpened bamboo poles. An officer from the 105th Infantry's 1st Battalion described the sound before visual contact, a low roar of voices, thousands of men shouting, audible over the surf. The forward positions of the 1st and 2nd Battalions absorbed the initial impact. Rifle fire, machine gun fire, mortars, all of it poured into the approaching mass, and all of it killed men, and none of it stopped the momentum. The Japanese just kept feeding bodies into the corridor. When the first rank fell, the second rank ran over them. When a machine gun cut a gap, the men behind filled it. The mathematics favored the attacker at this density and frontage. 4,000 men pressing into a battalion front meant the Americans faced roughly 10-to-1 odds on the point of contact. Foxholes that held for 15 minutes got flanked, bypassed, overrun. What happened to Salomon and every other medical position behind that line traces back to one structural fact about banzai charges. A banzai charge does not capture ground and consolidate. It rolls forward. It does not stop to clear bunkers or establish a new perimeter. The Japanese troops who punched through the forward foxholes kept moving south at speed, which meant every rear area installation, aid stations, command posts, supply dumps, communication nodes, suddenly sat in the middle of an active assault rather than behind a defensive line. The 27th Division's after-action report used the word engulfed, not flanked, not enveloped in the doctrinal sense, engulfed. The Japanese wave washed over fixed positions, the way water covers rocks at high tide, surrounding them on all sides simultaneously. Salomon's aid station, 50 yards behind the 2nd Battalion perimeter, went from rear echelon medical facility to frontline fighting position in under 20 minutes. Warning came too late to relocate. Time ran out to evacuate patients on litters, and no infantry reserve existed to plug the gap because the gap had become the entire front. The wounded men lying on stretchers inside that tent had survived their first brush with Japanese fire, only to find Japanese soldiers standing over them with bayonets. The aid station personnel, surgeons, corpsmen, litter bearers, carried sidearms and nothing heavier. They held Geneva Convention protections that the Imperial Japanese Army had never ratified and did not recognize. Against an enemy that bayoneted wounded men on stretchers, the Red Cross on a white armband functioned as a target indicator, not a shield. Salomon understood this with a clarity that his subsequent actions made unmistakable. The Colt M1911 pistol that every American medical officer carried on Saipan weighed 2 pounds, 7 ounces loaded. 7 rounds of .45 ACP in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 8 shots. Against a banzai charge involving thousands, those 8 rounds represented a psychological gesture more than a tactical tool. But the pistol mattered for a different reason. It marked American medical personnel as armed, and under Japanese field doctrine, armed meant killable without distinction. The Western assumption here runs deep, and it needs separating from the Japanese one. Most armies train their soldiers to recognize the Red Cross symbol and treat medical personnel as protected non-combatants. Japan never ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention. More importantly, Imperial Japanese Army field regulations made no operational distinction between a rifleman and a surgeon. The Senjinkun, the field service code issued in January 1941 under Tojo's name, addressed the conduct of soldiers in combat with an absolutism that left zero room for categories of protected persons. Everyone on the battlefield constituted an enemy. Everyone got killed. But the doctrinal hostility toward medical positions went beyond mere indifference to Geneva protections. Japanese tactical planning actively prioritized rear area targets during penetration attacks. The Imperial Army's infantry manual specified that once a breakthrough occurred, lead elements should bypass strongpoints and strike deep into the enemy's support area, specifically targeting communications, command posts, and medical installations. The logic held a brutal internal coherence. Destroy an aid station, and the wounded from the initial assault die. Destroy a command post and coordination collapses. Cut communications and artillery support goes blind. A banzai charge that merely killed riflemen in foxholes accomplished nothing strategic. A charge that gutted the organizational infrastructure behind those foxholes could theoretically paralyze an entire battalion. The assumption underneath all of this, the load-bearing wall of the entire gyokusai concept, held that American rear echelon personnel would not fight. Japanese military intelligence assessments from 1942 and 43 consistently characterized American support troops as poorly trained, psychologically fragile, dependent on material comfort. U.S. SBS interrogations conducted after the war revealed that mid-ranking Japanese officers believed, with apparent conviction, that once their assault elements reached the aid stations and supply dumps, resistance would evaporate. Clerks would run. Surgeons would surrender. Supply sergeants would abandon their posts. The whole rotten structure would come apart from the inside. This belief had not been tested at scale before Saipan. Smaller banzai charges on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the marshals had produced mixed results, but none matched the concentration of force that Saito ordered on July 7th. The Tanapag charge represented the first time the Japanese committed an entire garrison, every breathing soldier, to a single penetration attack against a U.S. Army division holding a continuous front. If the doctrine worked anywhere, it should have worked here. Narrow frontage, overwhelming local numbers, darkness for the approach, and a known gap between the 105th Infantry's battalions that Japanese scouts had identified days earlier. So, when the first wave broke through the 2nd Battalion's perimeter and Japanese soldiers began pouring into the area around Salomon's aid station, they arrived with a specific expectation. Medical tents meant soft targets, wounded men on stretchers meant helpless victims, and a captain with a Red Cross brassard, in their calculus, meant a man who would put his hands up. Salomon did not put his hands up. The first Japanese soldier who entered the aid station and drove a bayonet into a patient on a litter encountered something the doctrine had not prepared him for. An American surgeon who kicked the rifle out of his hands and killed him. A second soldier came through the tent entrance. Salomon shot him with the M1911. A third, same result. The records from the Medal of Honor citation, not finalized until 2002, 58 years after the action, describe Salomon engaging enemy soldiers inside the tent with a combination of his pistol, a captured rifle, and at one point his bare hands, before he ordered the surviving wounded evacuated and repositioned outside with a weapon he had no formal training to operate. 8 rounds in the Colt, then improvisation. The doctrine that predicted collapse instead produced the opposite. Salomon had already killed 4 men inside the tent before the 5th came through carrying a saber instead of a rifle. He headbutted that one, took the blade, and used it. A dentist, 30 years old, fighting with a Japanese officer's sword in a canvas aid station on a Pacific island at 4:30 in the morning. The sequence needs specifics. Benjamin Lewis Salomon graduated from the University of Southern California Dental School in 1937. He enlisted as a private in the Army in 1940, not as a dentist, as an infantryman. Volunteered, carried a garand, ran obstacle courses, qualified on the rifle range. The Army looked at his file, noticed the dental degree, and commissioned him as a first lieutenant in the Dental Corps in 1942. Salomon reportedly objected. He wanted to stay in the line. The Army said no. The service needed dentists more than it needed one extra rifle platoon leader. So he went where ordered, joined the 27th Infantry Division, and spent the next 2 years filling cavities and pulling teeth on a succession of Pacific islands, while the division trained for combat operations. Japanese intelligence never grasped this about the American military medical system. It did not produce pure clinicians. It produced soldiers who happened to practice medicine. Every medical officer in the U.S. Army completed basic military training. Everyone qualified with a sidearm. Many, like Salomon, had infantry experience before their commissioning. The Army Medical Department's own training program at Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania included field sanitation, evacuation under fire, defensive perimeter operations, and weapons familiarization. A Japanese Army surgeon received medical training and nothing else. An American Army surgeon received medical training layered on top of a foundation that assumed he might need to fight. Salomon took this further than most. According to personnel records cited in his Medal of Honor documentation, he regularly volunteered for infantry patrols on Makin Island in late 1943, months before Saipan, despite holding a dental billet. His battalion commander noticed. When the 2nd Battalion's surgeon slot opened before the Saipan operation, Salomon requested the transfer, a dentist asking to move closer to the front lines. The request went through. By June of 1944, Captain Salomon served as the de facto battalion surgeon for 2nd Battalion, 105th Infantry, running the forward aid station that sat 50 yards behind the perimeter. Look at what the American personnel system accidentally assembled in that tent. A man with infantry training who chose medicine, a clinician with combat instincts who volunteered for a forward surgical position. He had already proven under fire on Makin that he would not freeze. None of this appeared in any Japanese intelligence assessment of American medical capabilities. Their analysts cataloged American equipment, shipping tonnage, aircraft production rates. They tracked division movements and command assignments. They did not track, because they could not conceive of, a military culture that turned its doctors into fighters as a matter of routine institutional practice. The gap between expectation and reality started here, in the bureaucratic guts of the American replacement system. Japan produced medical officers who bowed when captured. America produced medical officers who picked up enemy weapons when their pistol ran dry. That gap had nothing to do with individual courage. Courage existed on both sides of that beach. It lived in training pipelines, institutional assumptions, and a basic philosophical disagreement about what a doctor on a battlefield should be prepared to do. By 5 a.m. on July 7th, the forward perimeter had collapsed entirely. Japanese troops moved through the 2nd Battalion area in groups of 10 and 20, killing wounded Americans where they found them. Salomon had cleared his aid station of living patients, ordered his corpsmen to evacuate south with the litter cases, and refused to leave himself. He had a working knowledge of the M1917 heavy machine gun, not from dental school, but from his months as an enlisted infantryman back in 1940. The weapon sat on a tripod near a destroyed foxhole, its previous crew dead. Salomon dragged it to a position covering the northern approach, loaded a belt, charged the handle, and opened fire into the darkness. The canvas weighed 12 pounds per panel. Standard Army shelter half material, olive drab, treated with a paraffin compound that turned rain but trapped heat like an oven. 4 panels stitched and lashed to a pole frame made one surgical tent. Salomon's aid station ran 2 of them, pitched end to end on a flat stretch of crushed coral 50 yards south of the 2nd Battalion's rearmost foxholes. The coral mattered. Saipan's soil turned to red clay soup after every rain squall, and a surgeon operating on a man's abdomen could not afford mud splashing into an open wound. Crushed coral drained fast, packed hard, stayed relatively clean. Somebody in the battalion's medical section had chosen this ground deliberately. The 27th Division's medical annex noted that aid station placement on Saipan prioritized drainage, vehicle access for ambulance jeeps, and proximity to a water source. Salomon's station sat near a shallow well that produced brackish but usable water for instrument sterilization. Not ideal, functional. Inside, the arrangement followed the standard battalion aid station layout, prescribed by FM 8-10, the Army's field manual for medical service in a theater of operations. Wounded arrived at the receiving area on the north end, the end facing the front line. Litter bearers set them down. A triage officer sorted them, those who needed immediate surgery, those who could wait for evacuation to the regimental collecting station further south, those beyond help. The surgical area occupied the center of the connected tents, where two folding operating tables sat under a rigged overhead light powered by a portable generator. The smell in that space defied casual description. Blood oxidizing on canvas in tropical humidity produces a copper-sweet odor that saturates fabric and never fully leaves. Ether vapor from anesthesia pooled at floor level because the compound runs heavier than air. Sulfanilamide powder, the universal wound treatment of 1944, carried its own acrid chemical bite. Mix those with sweat, with the iodine solution used for skin prep, with the diesel exhaust drifting in from the generator, and the aid station atmosphere became something a man remembered in his sinuses for decades. According to the division's medical officer roster, Salomon had 2 assistants and 4 enlisted corpsmen working that station on the night of July 6th. 8 men total, including Salomon, responsible for every casualty the 2nd Battalion produced. The perimeter separating this operation from the Japanese advance consisted of foxholes dug by infantrymen from Baker and Charlie companies. No wire, no mines along the battalion rear boundary. Those had been emplaced forward, facing north toward the expected Japanese positions. The distance from the nearest foxhole to the tent entrance measured roughly the length of a football field's end zone. 10 yards, give or take. A man running at full sprint covered that distance in under 2 seconds. The terrain between the perimeter and the aid station offered no obstacles. Flat coral, a few palm stumps shattered by naval gunfire during the pre-invasion bombardment, some scattered supply crates. Any Japanese soldier who penetrated the foxhole line faced an unobstructed path to the surgical tents. No fallback position existed between the infantry and the surgeons. The aid station had been sited for efficiency, not defense, because battalion doctrine assumed the perimeter would hold. When the perimeter dissolved at 4 a.m. on July 7th, that assumption evaporated with it, and the geography became a killing funnel pointed directly at Salomon's patients. The generator still hummed. The overhead light still burned. From 300 yards out, approaching through cane fields in pre-dawn darkness, that light marked the aid station's position as clearly as a signal flare. Nobody turned it off. Salomon had men open on the table. Shutting down the light meant letting a wounded American bleed out in the dark to buy a few extra minutes of concealment. He kept operating. The light stayed on. Japanese soldiers oriented on it like moths, and the 10-yard gap between the last foxhole and the tent entrance shrank to nothing in the time it took a man to chamber a round. According to the 27th Division's after-action report, the first sound carried across the cane fields at approximately 04:15 hours. A massed human voice, thousands of throats producing a roar that survivors described not as a scream, but as a sustained, rising wail. The report uses the word unearthly, their word. Saito's formation moved south in a column that stretched nearly a mile deep along the coastal road and the adjacent cane fields. The lead elements carried rifles with fixed bayonets. Behind them came men armed with sharpened sticks, officers' swords, rocks lashed to wooden handles. Some carried nothing at all. The organizational structure had dissolved hours before the charge began. Infantry mixed with artillerymen who had spiked their guns, naval personnel from the harbor garrison, walking wounded with bandages still wet, 4,000 men compressed into a frontage of roughly 400 yards, aimed at the seam between 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105 Infantry. Japanese scouts had mapped that seam. They knew the gap existed. What they fed back to Saito's staff about American dispositions behind it remains unknown. Those scouts died in the charge with everyone else, and their reporting chains ceased to exist by dawn. The first foxholes fell in under 90 seconds. Baker Company's forward outposts, two-man positions spaced 15 to 20 yards apart, simply vanished beneath the weight of bodies. A foxhole designed to protect two riflemen against aimed fire from the front cannot function when 40 men rush it simultaneously from 3 directions. The Americans in those holes fired, killed the men directly in front of them, and died under the ones who followed. Some positions got off 2 or 3 magazine loads before being overrun. Others managed a single shot. The Japanese took casualties at a rate that should have stalled any conventional assault. Bodies stacked in the coral depressions where foxholes had been, 830 rounds per minute from the few automatic weapons positioned on the line. But the charge operated outside conventional tactical logic. Stopping meant dying without purpose. Advancing meant dying with it. The entire moral architecture of gyokusai demanded forward movement regardless of losses, and the men in that column had spent the previous evening drinking sake, writing death poems, and burning personal effects they did not intend to need again. 300 yards behind Baker Company's disintegrating line, that generator still hummed. Salomon's overhead light still carved a yellow rectangle into the pre-dawn darkness. The Japanese soldiers who poured through the breach did not need maps or compass bearings to find the aid station. They followed the light and the sound of the generator, the way a man follows a lit window across an open field at night, instinctively, without decision. Groups of 10 and 15 split off from the main column as it pushed south, drawn toward exactly the kind of rear area target their doctrine told them to destroy. Medical tents, supply dumps, anything that smelled like support infrastructure. The main body kept moving toward the 105th's regimental headquarters, further south, but these splinter groups peeled east and west, hunting. The first Japanese soldiers reached the aid station's receiving area at approximately 0430. They arrived at a full run, bayonets forward, expecting what their training and intelligence briefs had promised. Helpless men, stretcher cases, a doctor with his hands in a wound and no capacity to resist. What they found instead defied every assumption baked into the assault plan. Salomon had already shifted from surgeon to combatant. The patients who could move had been armed with whatever lay within reach. The tent that Japanese doctrine classified as the softest target on the American position became, in the space of about 15 minutes, one of the hardest. Not because of fortification or firepower, the aid station had neither, but because the men inside it refused to perform the role the enemy had assigned them. The doctrine predicted surrender and got a knife fight. Where it predicted panic, a dentist with a pistol methodically engaged targets at ranges measured in feet, not yards, inside a canvas box that smelled like blood and ether and sulfanilamide. The gap between prediction and reality killed Japanese soldiers faster than any machine gun could have. So what does a dentist do when a bayonet comes through the tent flap and finds a man on a stretcher? Salomon answered that at 0432, or close to it. The timeline compresses here because nobody inside that tent had a functioning watch hand free to check. The first Japanese soldier through the receiving area drove his bayonet into a patient lying on a canvas litter. The patient had a chest wound already dressed and bandaged. The bayonet went through the bandage, through the chest, into the coral underneath. Salomon crossed the tent in 2 steps, drew his M1911, and shot the man at a distance you could measure with your arm. The 45 ACP round at contact range does not require elaboration. The soldier dropped across the patient he had just killed. A second came through before the first finished falling, then a third. Salomon fired until the pistol locked back on an empty magazine. 8 rounds total, 7 from the magazine and 1 from the chamber. He killed 4 men inside that tent with those 8 rounds. The 5th entered carrying a saber, not a rifle, which suggests an officer or senior NCO. Salomon had no loaded weapon. He headbutted the man, took the saber from him. The Medal of Honor citation describes this sequence without additional detail, and the citation is the only surviving primary source for the interior fighting, and used the blade to kill its owner. Then, he picked up a rifle from one of the dead Japanese soldiers on the tent floor and used that. The interior of the aid station during these 90 seconds occupied a space roughly 12 feet wide and 30 feet long. 2 operating tables. At least 4 American wounded on litters who could not move. Blood on the coral, spent brass rolling underfoot, canvas walls that stopped light but not bullets. Salomon fought in this space the way a man fights in a hallway, close enough to smell what he killed, close enough that missing meant dying. The ether vapor still hung at floor level. One muzzle flash in the wrong direction, and the entire tent becomes an incendiary event. That didn't happen. Luck, or the fact that ether requires a specific fuel-air mixture to ignite. The records don't say which. Between 0430 and 0445, Salomon made a sequence of decisions that the after-action reconstruction can only approximate. He cleared the tent of enemy dead. He assessed his patients, some already killed by bayonets, others still alive. He ordered his corpsmen to begin evacuation south, carrying every man who still breathed. 4 corpsmen, multiple litter cases, moving on foot through broken terrain in darkness while a battle raged around them. Salomon told them to go. He stayed. Everything this story means runs through the decision to stay. A medical officer's duty under the Geneva Convention runs to his patients. Salomon fulfilled that duty by ordering their evacuation. A combatant's duty runs to the defense of his position. Salomon fulfilled that by remaining alone at the aid station with a weapon he had trained on 4 years earlier as an enlisted private. Both duties satisfied simultaneously by a man whose official military specialty involved drilling molars. The Japanese officer who planned the gyokusai expected the aid station to produce prisoners or corpses. Instead, it produced a one-man blocking position that bought his corpsmen the 15 minutes they needed to drag wounded Americans beyond the perimeter breach. He found the M1917 near a collapsed foxhole 10 yards north of the tent. Its crew, 2 infantrymen whose names do not appear in the records available, had died at their position. The gun sat on its tripod, barrel pointed north, ammunition belt still feeding from an open crate. The water jacket held enough fluid to function, though not for long. Salomon seated himself behind it, charged the operating handle, and pressed the butterfly trigger. The weapon cycled at 450 rounds per minute. At that rate, a 250-round belt lasts roughly 33 seconds of continuous fire. He fed belt after belt into the gun as Japanese soldiers continued south through the breach, silhouetted against burning cane fields to the north. Dawn had not broken. The light from the fires gave him his targets. The generator behind him still ran, painting his back with that yellow glow, marking him for every rifleman within 300 yards. He did not leave. Sergeant Harold Gruber reached the aid station at 0740, 3 hours after the charge began, leading a 4-man patrol sent south from the reorganizing remnants of Charlie Company to assess what remained of the battalion's medical capability. He found Salomon draped forward over the M1917's receiver, both hands still on the spade grips, his right thumb resting against the butterfly trigger. The barrel had cooked off its water jacket. The cooling sleeve displayed a 6-inch rupture along the top seam where steam pressure had blown the metal open like a split pipe. The ammunition crate beside the gun held nothing but empty belt links and cardboard dividers. Gruber's patrol counted the Japanese dead before they moved Salomon's body. According to the platoon sergeant's report filed 2 days later, a report that eventually fed into the battalion's consolidated after-action summary, the count reached 98. The bodies formed a rough semicircle extending from the gun's 10 o'clock to its 2 o'clock, concentrated most densely between 30 and 50 yards out, thinning at the edges of the arc. Some lay in clusters of 3 and 4, where they had fallen together mid-stride. Others sprawled individually at distances as close as 8 yards from the muzzle. One lay across the tripod's left leg, close enough that Salomon could have reached down and touched him without shifting his seat. 8 yards, then tripod distance. The Japanese had gotten close enough to bayonet range before the gun cut them down, which means Salomon kept firing into men he could see clearly enough to recognize as individual human beings, not silhouettes, not shapes in the dark. Dawn had broken by then. The cane field fires had died to smoldering stalks. Full tropical daylight at that latitude arrives fast, and the last attackers who reached Salomon's position did so in something close to full visibility. The wounds on Salomon's body required a separate medical examination. The regimental surgeon who performed the field assessment cataloged 76 distinct entry points: gunshot wounds from rifle and pistol caliber rounds, bayonet punctures through his torso and arms, at least one saber cut across his left shoulder. 76. Some of those wounds had bled freely onto his uniform and the gun mount beneath him. Others showed minimal bleeding, indicating they occurred after his heart had stopped or slowed to the point where arterial pressure could no longer push blood through the tissue. This detail matters because it establishes a timeline the clock cannot. Salomon absorbed wounds, kept firing, absorbed more, and continued operating the weapon through injuries that individually would have combat incapacitated most men. The medical examiner's language in the consolidated report stays clinical. Salomon sustained multiple penetrating trauma wounds across the engagement period. No estimate of when he died relative to the last belt he fired. The M1917's barrel condition suggests he burned through at least 1,000 rounds, probably more. The water jacket does not fail until sustained fire has superheated the barrel beyond the cooling system's capacity, and that takes time measured in minutes of continuous trigger depression, not seconds. Look at the geometry. 98 bodies in a semicircle, densest at center mass of the firing arc. That pattern matches a single gun position, engaging successive waves from a fixed orientation. Salomon did not reposition. He did not fall back. He sat behind a crew-served weapon designed for 2 operators, one to fire, one to feed belts and manage the cooling system, and ran it alone, feeding his own belts until the barrel physically destroyed itself and his body stopped functioning. The semicircle measured roughly 80 yards across at its widest point. Every man in that arc had advanced toward the sound of the gun and died facing it. His corpsman made it out. The 4 enlisted men carrying wounded Americans south through the darkness reached friendly lines near the regimental collecting station. Every patient who left that aid station breathing arrived alive at the next echelon of care. Salomon bought that outcome with the gun, the belt crate. However many minutes his body continued to operate after the first bullet found him, and nothing else. The precise number of minutes stays unknown. The barrel split. 98 men stopped moving. The patrol found him still gripping the trigger. So why did the man found with 98 dead enemies in front of him and 76 wounds in his body wait until 2002 for the Medal of Honor? The answer is Geneva. Specifically, Article 28 of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which states that medical personnel shall not be considered prisoners of war if captured and shall be returned to their own forces, a protection contingent on their non-combatant status. The moment a medical officer picks up a weapon and uses it offensively, he forfeits that protection. The Army's position, maintained through 4 separate nomination attempts beginning in 1945, held that awarding the Medal of Honor to a medical officer for killing enemy soldiers would formally acknowledge that an American doctor had violated the convention. The nomination went forward in 1951. Denied. Again in 1953. Denied. A third attempt in the late 60s stalled inside the decorations board without reaching a decision. Each time, the same legal objection surfaced like a cork that refused to stay underwater. Captain Salomon bore arms as a medical officer, and recognizing that act with the nation's highest military decoration would establish precedent, the Army's Judge Advocate General found unacceptable. The bureaucratic logic here operated in a sealed room, disconnected from the coral flat where Salomon actually died. Geneva protects medical personnel who refrain from combat. Salomon's patients had just been bayoneted on their litters. The convention's framers in 1929 built protections around an assumption that belligerents would respect the Red Cross, that wounded men on stretchers occupied a category beyond targeting. The Japanese on Saipan did not recognize that category. They stabbed men through their bandages. The legal framework that denied Salomon his medal for 58 years rested on a reciprocity that the enemy had already destroyed before Salomon drew his pistol. He violated a contract the other party had shredded first, but the deeper problem ran wider than one dentist on one island. According to the medical department's official history, the Green Book covering the Pacific theaters, instances of medical personnel engaging in combat occurred with sufficient frequency across the Central and Western Pacific that the Surgeon General's office flagged it as a systemic policy concern by late 1944. Medics fought back, repeatedly, on Saipan, on Guam, on Peleliu, on Leyte. They fought because Japanese doctrine targeted them, and dead medics treat no one. The Army could not award Salomon without implicitly endorsing every corpsman who had grabbed a carbine when bayonets came through the aid station canvas, and that endorsement would undermine the Geneva framework that protected American medical personnel in theaters where the enemy did observe the convention, namely Europe. The Western Front mattered to the lawyers more than the Central Pacific mattered to the dead. Bureaucracy, as always. The nomination finally succeeded under President George W. Bush on May 1, 2002. The breakthrough came not from new evidence or a change in legal interpretation, but from a shift in framing. The final citation emphasizes that Salomon ordered his patients evacuated before he engaged the enemy, establishing that he acted as a combatant only after fulfilling his medical obligation, not instead of fulfilling it. The distinction reads as hair-splitting to anyone who has absorbed the previous 8 sections of this story, but it gave the Decorations Board the procedural exit ramp it needed to approve what everyone involved already knew deserved approval. Salomon's surviving family members, he never married, never had children, attended the ceremony at the White House through nephews and extended relatives who carried a name most of them had grown up hearing in fragments, half-remembered stories about an uncle who died on an island nobody in the family had visited. The medal arrived 58 years after the barrel split and the water jacket blew, and Gruber's patrol found a dentist from Milwaukee slumped over a machine gun with 76 holes in him. 58 years of paperwork to describe what took roughly 3 hours of dying to accomplish. The Army's filing system outlasted the man, the gun, the tent, the generator, the war itself, and nearly outlasted everyone who remembered any of it happened. By 0900 on July 8, 1944, the gyokusai had spent itself. Saito's charge accomplished exactly the opposite of its operational intent. The plan called for 4,000 men to punch through the American line at Tanapag, overrun the artillery positions behind it, and drive south to the coast, disrupting the invasion's logistics badly enough to buy time for a counterattack that existed only in the planning documents of men who knew they would not survive to execute it. Instead, the charge funneled Japan's remaining organized combat power on Saipan into a corridor roughly 800 yards wide and drove it directly into American automatic weapons, pre-registered artillery, and, at the aid station on the southern edge of the breach, a dentist operating a water-cooled machine gun alone in the dark. The results arrived in arithmetic. The Japanese command structure on Saipan did not survive to tabulate. Of the approximately 4,300 men who participated in the charge, the 27th Division's Consolidated After-Action Report lists an estimated 4,311 Japanese dead recovered in the division's sector between July 8th and July 10th. Sources conflict on the precise figure. The 105th Infantry Regiment's own count ran slightly lower, and Graves' registration teams working the Tanapag Plain through July 12th continued finding bodies in the cane fields, but every source agrees on the ratio, functionally total. The charge did not weaken the Japanese garrison. It deleted it. Saito, already dead by his own hand before the first wave crossed the start line, had ordered the destruction of his own army and called it an attack. The operational consequence landed fast. Organized Japanese resistance on Saipan collapsed within 72 hours of the charge. Mopping up operations continued through August, but the island's strategic contest ended on that coral flat between 04:15 and dawn. the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War, produced the fastest transition from contested battle to secured island in the Marianas Campaign. Actions intended to shatter the American rear instead eliminated the only force capable of contesting the American front. Every rifle and saber and grenade carrier who followed Saito's order into the breach left a defensive position somewhere else on the island unmanned. The charge hollowed out the Japanese perimeter from the inside. American medical personnel absorbed part of that charge at the exact point where Japanese doctrine predicted the softest resistance: aid stations, collecting points, surgical tents, the rear area targets that an attacking force expects to roll through without serious opposition. On Saipan, the rear area fought back with a ferocity that the doctrine never modeled. Salomon's aid station represented one position among several that engaged the breakthrough, but his 98 confirmed kills from a single gun constituted the densest localized body count attributed to any individual position in the division's sector that night. The 27th Division's after-action report does not editorialize on this point. It lists the position, the weapon, the count, and the operator's name, rank, and military occupational specialty. Captain Ben Salomon, gruesome 0210, dental officer. The report filed with V Amphibious Corps Headquarters carries the classification confidential, later downgraded. The Medal of Honor citation, General Orders No. 85, dated 2002, references the same engagement under Department of the Army Case File 2-01749. The original nomination paperwork from 1945 survives in the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, folder partially damaged in the 1973 fire, but legible. The field medical report listing Salomon's 76 wounds carries no separate file number. It fed into the regimental surgeon's monthly casualty summary for July 1944, gruesome Saipan series, 27th Infantry Division Surgeon's Office. The after-action report for the 105th Infantry Regiment, covering the period July 1st through July 9th, 1944, cataloged the engagement at the aid station under Section 4, Paragraph 12, Enemy Penetration of Battalion Rear Area, Medical Section. Gruber's patrol report, the one that established the body count, carries no independent document number. It exists as an annex to the Battalion S3 Journal, entry number 247, 0740 hours, July 8, 1944.